Got two handouts today. You got exercise 104, which we're going to walk through together, but you also got your first assignment. You got assignment 101. Now, assignment 101 is going to be due a week from today. It's due on Wednesday. Normally, I would give you more time, but being the kind-hearted person that I am, I didn't think you wanted something due right when you got back from President's Weekend. So I gave you the weekend off, and it's due before President's Weekend, so you don't have to worry about it. Okay? So you sacrifice. It's due a little sooner, but you don't have to worry about it when you have your time off, which is generally my goal. When we get to spring break, I'll try to do the same thing. If I have to cram something in before so that you don't have to stress out on spring break, I'll do that as well. I remember back to when I was a student, and I always hated it when there was something due right when you got back. So anyway, it is what it is. So assignment 101 is going to be your best photograph. It does have to be a photo that was taken from the start of this semester on. So you can't use something that you took over winter break. Okay, so it has to be a current photo. The idea is that you would have thought about the stuff that we've talked about, and you might take a better photo. You will be asked to do post-processing on that image. The post-processing, we will start working today, kind of learning techniques. We'll do a little bit more on Monday of next week. Through those two lectures, you should be pretty well ready to do whatever you need to do in terms of post-processing on this image. There will be another assignment relating to Photoshop in this class, so that's why there's two kind of back-to-back. And that one will deal with more of the advanced techniques that are going to be in Photoshop. Let's see, what else? You are going to turn in the original image, the post-processed image, and you're going to write a little summary of what you did in relation to this. That will all be posted on the website. Okay, so original image, processed image, and a little summary. Okay, you will also print only your final image to the school printer, which is the color one is the C5550 here. I think it costs like 25 cents or something like that. It's reasonable. You're going to print a paper copy. The colors on the paper copy and the print quality will not be that great, but it gives me a record of what you actually turned in, and you will not get that one back. Okay, so it's something that I keep as a record. Okay, but it shouldn't be too hard. The part that I'm most concerned about is the post. That has to be done before class a week from today. Right, so remember, it's due as soon as we start class. It's late, so you have to make sure that post. If you didn't get it printed or you're having trouble printing or whatever, I'm not really concerned with this assignment that it's printed on time. I just want it that day. Okay, but the key is to make sure that that post is there. Okay, we will go through exercise 104, every step in order, but I'm going to lecture first. We'll take a quick break, enough time for me to refill some tea so I can keep talking, and then we'll go through and do the exercise 104 in a step-by-step manner. Okay, let's see if we can get switched over here. It would help if I plugged in my computer, which is going to happen right now. And then we'll turn off the lights. Okay, so today we're going to talk about processing your photos and developing a digital workflow, and what a workflow means, and what steps are typically involved in doing post-processing of images. And unless you're an absolutely outstanding photographer, chances are you're going to do some post-processing. Even professional photographers tend to do post-processing on their images. If you're really, really good, if you're the Ansel Adams out there, maybe you could get away without doing post-processing. Though I would suspect that in the development of his photos, back in the world of film, he probably did a little bit of post-processing, but more chemical processing than digital processing, obviously. So what is a digital workflow? The term workflow refers to a set of steps that you as a photographer tend to go through in dealing with your images. And it's going to vary a great deal depending on who you are as a photographer and what your skill level is as a photographer. There is an awful lot that you can correct after the fact. Okay? But if we start with kind of the key components of a workflow, It begins by going out and capturing the images in the first place. Obviously, the workflow can't start unless you have the images to work with. The next step is generally downloading the image to your computer, organizing them some way so that you know where they are. This could involve using some kind of a photo management application. That could be something that's free. It could be something that's paid for. Depends, again, on what computer you're using, what operating system you're using, as to what your options are. We'll talk a little bit more about those as we go forward. Next, it will be post-processing the images. This is where you go through and you do the error correcting, the things that didn't quite show up correctly. Maybe you do a levels adjustment to pull out the blacks a little bit more. There's certain things that you tend to do. And then finally, you're going to output your images to some kind of a format that is useful. That might be that you post your images on Facebook or Instagram. It might mean that you go have your images printed. It may be, if you're a professional photographer, you're going to go like have a giant print made for the wall or something, right? So it's going to vary depending on what the final output would be. My guess is that a lot of you kind of already have a workflow. And it could be a very compressed workflow, like you took a picture with your phone and you posted it to Instagram, right? Maybe there's one more step of you cropped it, right? Or you put a filter on it or whatever, okay? But that is essentially a very, very basic workflow, right? Now we're going to try to extend this out a little bit because we're going to interject Photoshop in, and that's going to be part of your workflow right now. It doesn't mean that in the future you'll always run every one of your pictures through Photoshop, right? It's a lot of work to run a picture through Photoshop, but if you have one particular photo that you really want to be good, running a pass through Photoshop is not a bad idea, okay? So you want to think about what software you plan to use, right? Obviously, this is a good point to think about how do you back up your images in the first place, right? Where do you store them? What post-processing do you typically need to do? For me, I almost always have to do a levels adjustment on any photo that I take. For whatever reason, I just seem to always fall in that category. So I know that that's something that I'm going to do, right? Are there any steps you can automate, right? If you have some more computer skill, you might be able to automate some stuff so that it just happens without you having to do it. And then ultimately, how is your photo going to be used, which is relevant. So when you're picking software, do you have a Windows or do you have a Mac? The software varies depending on which you have. One is not better than the other. I tend to get the question about, should I buy a Mac or should I buy a PC? That's a whole different kind of rat hole that we could go down. But the point is, it doesn't matter for what we're doing. There's good software for either one. Photoshop is available for either one. Okay? Is it going to be your personal computer? Is it going to be a lab computer? Is it going to be your iPad or your iPhone or your Android phone or whatever? Or is it going to be, just some kind of an online service? There is some shockingly good, and I'll show you an example of it a little bit later, online services that basically mimic the capabilities of Photoshop. So without having to buy anything, you can use one of those services. The other thing you want to think about is when you're doing your edits, is it going to be a destructive editing process or non-destructive editing? And this basically means, can you apply your edits as layers such that you can turn them off? Can you go backwards, right? Photoshop is great as a non-destructive editor because you layer up all of these layers and you can elect to turn it on, turn it off, depending on whether you like the end result or not. And that's one of the big advantages of using something like Photoshop. Some of the other software that's out there will let you do this as well, but it's important to distinguish as to whether those are capable. The other thing is, are you going to be doing something that's free, which is generally good somewhere in the neighborhood of 0 to 10,000 images, or do you need some kind of a pro, semi-pro option that might be good for lots and lots more images, right? It depends. My photo archive is somewhere in the neighborhood of 60,000 images or so. Might be a few more now. So I have to deal with, how do I manage 60,000 images, right? That's very different than managing 1,000 images. So you have to think about that a bit. So let's look at some of the free options that are out there. Google wrote a software that's called Picasa. Some of you may have heard of it before. It's available for Windows or for Mac. It basically has a lot of the features that you would expect in terms of organization, in terms of basic processing, levels adjustments, those kinds of things. It is a non-destructive editor, which is great, so you can reverse things that you do. Better than all of that, it's free, and you can download it without a problem, which is great. It does have basic organization through albums. I think they put in facial recognition as well now. It's not something that I use on a primary basis, so I'm not super familiar with it, but I like to point it out as something that's available. There is Photoshop Express, which is available. It used to be online only. Now it's for your iPad or your iPhone or your Android phone or whatever. That gives you kind of a stripped down version of post-processing available like Photoshop, but it tends to be a destructive editing process as opposed to a non-destructive editing. So once you do changes, they're kind of permanent, or at least on the version that you're working on, they're permanent. It has a few advanced editing features, but it's not certainly anywhere near what Photoshop itself is. So it's worth noting that you can get some out of it. Generally, you also have to have a connection to the internet. It doesn't like to work offline. But if you're on your phone, chances are you have a connection to the internet anyway, so it's not a big deal. Pixlr.com is another example. Now, this is a screenshot of Pixlr.com. Once you open up the actual photo editor, it looks an awful lot like what Photoshop looks like. The toolbar is almost identical. Most of the tools are the same. So you can, for free, get almost everything that you could get out of Photoshop. The big difference between these is that it doesn't have adjustment layers. So what you do is a permanent change. It's not something that you can go back and turn on and turn off, which is kind of the big downside of this. But it's free and it's almost exactly the same as Photoshop. So there's certainly an advantage. Photos, which is available for both iOS and your OS X machine. I like to touch on at least. Apple has for a long time decided to include with their products a really great photo management application. It used to be called iPhotos, now it's just called Photos. They actually used to have iPhoto and Aperture. Aperture was the professional version. iPhoto was the kind of consumer version. They got rid of both of those and just made one. So it has the capabilities that the advanced version does if you dig into it a bit. And so it's something that's worth noting. If you have a Mac, I would highly encourage you to use it because it's very, very well done. And it gives you a lot of the editing that you would otherwise need to do in Photoshop within the management application itself. So it saves some steps and saves some time. It's free for anybody who has a Mac. If you don't have a Mac, you're kind of out of luck. But it's worth at least pointing out. It does have facial recognition and a variety of other ways of organizing. So then we move into the professional options. In terms of how do you do it, there's really only two players in this field. They work together, not separately from each other. The first is written by Adobe, just like the company it's the same company who writes Photoshop. It's called Lightroom. It's kind of the high-end professional grade. Costs money to get, but it manages your photos and gives you a bunch of the features that Photoshop does built within this particular application. Very sophisticated, great program, but again, it costs money to do. So expensive, non-destructive editing of your images, which is what we're after. Extremely advanced editing features built right into the management. Great metadata support. We'll talk about what metadata is in a little bit. And you've got albums and photos, facial recognition, all of those kinds of organizational features that you would expect from a professional level piece of software. So the other thing is Photoshop. And Photoshop is what we're going to be dealing with in this class. It's available on all the lab computers for you to use. You can get a student version of it available on your own computer for a monthly rental fee. They've moved from having to actually buy the software to renting it. So it's certainly something that you can get relatively affordably. It is definitely non-destructive editing of your images. You can always go back, turn layers on, turn layers off as you go forward. It probably has the most advanced editing features of any program out there in terms of it basically can do anything that you can come up with. Your work is always stored on layers. Layers can be turned on or turned off as you work on the particular project, which is great once you start getting a really large file with a lot of stuff. Basic image editing that we'll do today won't create that many layers. Maybe we'll do 5 or 6 layers. But when you're doing some kind of a collage at the end of the semester, you might have 20 or 30 layers. You might have more than that. And so that's one of the really powerful things. In Photoshop, you have something called pixel level correction, which basically means that what Photoshop does is it takes the image, right? And if you were to keep zooming in, and I'll do this a little bit later live so you can see it, at some point you'll see a grid of these little colored squares that make up your image, right? Well, you can go in and you can change the color of any one of those colored squares, thereby changing the image. So it's a very fine level of control in terms of what you can actually do. You can copy a part of an image to another part of the image. You can do those kinds of manipulations very, very easily in Photoshop. The disadvantage, because it is just a photo editor, is it doesn't have any photo organization stuff built in. So it's not going to back up your photos. It's not going to control where you put it. There's no albums. There's no facial recognition. It's just about how do you process the image. Okay? So let's talk a little bit about organizing your images. So when you take a photograph, because it's a digital photograph, within the digital file itself that your camera creates, it stores a bunch of extra information. It's information that you can't see, but that's stored with the file. If you guys remember back to the world of film cameras when you used to take them, maybe like your aunt took these kinds of pictures, right? And in the bottom of the prints that you got, there was like a little timestamp or the date or something. Right? It was in orange, right? Essentially what this is the digital equivalent of that, though we have a lot more information. So in terms of metadata, if I were to go out and take a picture with my camera, it's going to store that the picture was shot with a Nikon D80, which is my camera. Then it's going to tell me what lens I had attached to the camera. So in this case, it was an 18 to 135 millimeter lens, and I had it zoomed to 62 millimeters. Right? Kind of impressive. It tells me that I had an ISO of 125 when I shot it. It also tells me what my aperture was, right? Remembering back to last class, right? It's going to tell me what my shutter speed was, and my exposure value was set to 0. So it's giving me all that information, right? Below that, it's going to store other information like the date and time that I shot the particular file, right? The version name, etc. Now, if we shot with our phone, my camera doesn't have GPS, but if you shot with your phone, it would include the GPS coordinates of where you took the photo. Okay? So it includes a huge amount of information that you can go in and access and learn about the photo. Right? Most of the management applications allow you to sort by this kind of information or use that information in a way to help you organize. So there's a variety of organizational structures for your photos, whether you're using Picasa or you're using Photos for Mac or whatever. All of these are essentially the same. And they include folders, which are about as basic as they get. You put photos in a folder and name the folder. Right? Albums are a lot like a folder, though sometimes they have smart characteristics about show me all the files that were rated 5-star and better, or something like that. Events are groupings of photos that were taken in certain periods of time, and we'll talk about these more in a little bit. And faces are facial recognition, obviously, who's in the photo. Places are geographic locations stamped in from your GPS coordinates. So we already kind of went through folders. Albums are essentially folders, but you have a little bit finer control over what images are placed in a particular album. Events, this is where things start to get a little bit more sophisticated. So generally speaking, when you go out and shoot your photos, you shoot a group of photos together. You go to a birthday party, you shoot a bunch of photos, right? And this happens on your phone, it happens on your camera, whatever. Then you take some time off, a couple days, a couple weeks, depends, and then you shoot a bunch of photos together because you went on vacation, right? Well, computers are sophisticated enough to know that there are patterns in how you shoot your photos together, so it will group timed together photos into what they call events, right? Which makes a lot of sense intuitively, okay? If I'm at a birthday party and I shoot 200 photos, those 200 photos get grouped together. Then I take some time off, shoot another group, it groups them together. So it's rather intuitive. Faces, so facial recognition is such that we get kind of the consumer level of it in an application like this, where once you tag this is a particular person in a photo, it will look for that facial structure, and it will then say, hey, this person is in all these other photos. Right? So it's relatively sophisticated. The hardware can do it rather easily. The truth is with facial recognition that this software exists at a much more sophisticated level, such that any company running this kind of facial recognition could basically figure out who you are. I mean, you see this stuff on TV shows and whatever, which is just a small capture of what like the military capabilities are in terms of being able to search for specific facial structures. We're just seeing kind of the early pieces of it. It's kind of like that they have cars that drive themselves now, right? They're just afraid to release it to us because there's too many really weird drivers out there that would probably crash the cars, right? But the technology is already there. Same thing here with facial recognition. So places is just geotagged information on top of the photo. This is exactly where I took the photo. Show me all the pictures that I took at DVC, right? Works really well for cell phones that have GPS built in. Not so good for cameras like my D80 that doesn't have GPS built into it. Okay, so let's talk about the typical adjustments that are done to particular photos. Okay, the primary thing we talked about last class was composition. So what's the primary thing that we would be doing to photos? We'd be cropping as a way of editing. So I'll show you cropping today, but as essentially take the image, recrop it. Notice that most of the cropping tools look something like this that have the rule of thirds built into it. Right? No surprise. Helps us to arrange our cropping. Okay? Generally speaking, you're going to make the image smaller because you're cropping out information. Right? It's very difficult to make an image larger or to get resolution added to an image. So generally this is something that's causing stuff to get stripped away. Okay? So we might go from an image like this to something that's a close-up image. Right? I have a bunch of other examples here. Notice that all of the crops are using that rule of thirds. Right? There's the person nicely on the rule of thirds. Right? We move forward. This is a square composition, but we're centered in the rule of thirds. Instead of this image being square and centered with the dog and the child together, right? Notice that they're pulled to one side. We still follow the rule of thirds, even though it's not a rectangle. Okay? Another example here. This just somehow looks fantastic to me. I would like to be there working. Right? But anyway, rule of thirds, same concept. And we'll talk about that as we go forward. Okay? So the next thing that sometimes is an adjustment that needs to be made, much easier to do with a raw image than a JPEG image, but that is that you made a mistake in the exposure. It wasn't adjusted correctly when you shot the image. You go back and you change it a little bit darker, a little bit lighter to get the proper exposure for the image. Again, works much better with a raw image than a JPEG image or something like that. Generally, it's easier to lighten up dark images than it is to darken light images because it's harder to get detail back from white, which you guys saw in the last class. So you have something like this, right, that's way too dark in the initial exposure. Corrected exposure, you can see all of the hairs in the dog's face. Okay, that kind of stuff makes a difference. Brightness and contrast is kind of a heavy-handed adjustment. It's not something that I recommend because it doesn't give you the finer controls that you could otherwise have. There are better ways of doing it. But it is something that gives you kind of an overall adjustment of the image. Overall, the whole image becomes a little bit brighter, right? Or overall, the image has darker darks and lighter lights. So it might be something like this. We have kind of this muted image of grass. We do some adjustments to it. We get a little bit higher contrast between black and white and a little bit brighter as an overall image. Again, it's a little bit heavy-handed. Okay? Color or saturation, this is where we might adjust for the blue image. The white balance was off. Right? We might make the color of the image shift to a warmer set of colors because it was blue or something like that. We can also tint an image to a specific color. In the old days, they used to do a toning of image called sepia, which was kind of a brownish tone to an image. It's like a black and white, but it wasn't a true black and white. It was kind of a brown and white. We could do the same thing. We could tone the image to a particular color. So here's your black and white and sepia. You might go from a color image into something that was black and white. This is something that we'll talk about today. But then you could also tint it into kind of a more brown instead. Right? So here's the color image to black and white. One of the things that's important to discuss relating to black and white is sometimes your camera has a mode for shoot in black and white. Right? Much, much better to shoot in color and then convert to black and white after the fact. You have a lot finer control, and I'll show you in the live example today when I convert to black and white how much more control you have if you shoot in color first. Right? So shoot in color, then convert to black and white. Focus, you can sharpen an image to try to make a little bit better contrast at edges and make it appear a little bit. This is not something that you can dramatically change. Like if you have a blurry image, you can't suddenly make it in focus. Right? It's not going to make that kind of a change, but it can pop out some detail or add just a little bit of refinement to a particular image to help, right? The opposite is also true. We could blur out a bit of the image, right, leaving part of it in focus, which might be a good enhancement as well. So something like this, again, very hard to tell on the projector screen the difference. The original image is here on the left, the adjusted image is on the right, and if you look carefully, there's just a little bit more detail in the edges of this, right? Just a little bit, and that has to do with sharpening or detail. So it's micro contrast. It's small levels of contrast between 2 pixels. Red eye reduction. How many people have had this happen to their photos? Right? Very, very common. So the reason this happens, right, and once you understand the scientific reason, it starts to make sense, right? The reason it happens is because the flash on your camera is very, very close to the lens of the camera itself. Okay? And so especially when we get into the world of phones, right? There's the lens, there's the flash. They're really close together. Okay? So what happens, you take a picture, it's dark. Okay? When it's dark, your eyes, right, or the subject that you're taking a picture of, Robert's eyes, we're in the dark, right? Your pupils get really, really large. Okay? That's natural. It's something that would normally happen. Okay? When I go to take the picture, right, the flash comes out, and that light goes into your eye and reflects off the back of your eye, right? It comes back out. And when that happens, the camera captures it and makes your eyes red. Okay? So what we'd rather have happen is we'd rather have that not happen at all. So a lot of cameras have modes that are like red eye reduction mode, right, or something like that, and they pulse the flash before they actually take the picture. The purpose of that is to shrink your pupils, right? The flash comes out, your pupils shrink, then you take the picture, less light gets reflected, less likely to have it. Okay? The real way of fixing it is to separate the flash and the camera, right? And so if you've been to like a wedding, right, you've seen the wedding photographer running around and he has like a big contraption and then the flash is like over here, right? Or it has this like pointed up at the ceiling or whatever, right? The reason he's doing that, or she is doing that, is because he's separating the two so when he takes the picture, the light isn't going straight into the person's eyes and coming back at the camera, right? It's going in at an angle and reflecting off at angles, so it's not going to cause the red eye. Okay? The truth is, though, even if we have red eye, in Photoshop we can go in and change those pixels and get rid of the red eye. Right? It's not that hard. So then we move into some of the more advanced features, and these are the ones we're going to cover today in Photoshop. Levels is probably the most common adjustment that can happen to a photo. It's also one of the most dramatic ones that can be done. It doesn't work for all images. I'll show you a few today that levels are kind of irrelevant, right? But sometimes it makes a big difference. Okay? And so what we're doing is we're taking an image like this that's on the left, which isn't a bad image, but if we were to look carefully at this image and we were to pick out what is white and what is black, okay? The closest to black that we get is probably like right in here, right? But it's not really black. It's dark gray, okay? Likewise, if we were looking at white, maybe it's this part of the paint, or maybe it's this dot here, but it's not really pure white. It's kind of a really light gray, okay? So what we do with a levels adjustment is we say this point that's kind of light gray, I actually want it to be pure white. And this point that's dark gray, I actually want it to be pure black. And so we make that adjustment and we take this image and we make it more like this. So all of the detail and the shadows really creep out at you, right? And the whites are much brighter and much more vibrant. So it's a simple adjustment, but we're telling it where is black and where is white. Let me back up one slide. It's done through something called a histogram like this. This is the distribution of pixels in a particular image, right? This side being white, this side being black. So then if we were to take that last image and we were to count how many individual little squares were black, right? We'd put it on this graph. So there's one that's this dark, and then we go to medium gray, and we get a few more, and then we get a few more, and we get into kind of medium 50% gray or something. We get lots and lots of pixels, and then we come out, and maybe there's a few white pixels. Okay? So what we're doing is we're saying instead of the spectrum from black to white being from there to there, we say that actually this point is pure white and this point is pure black. So we pull those points in, right? And it'll make more sense when you actually do it as a live example. Curves, right? Curves are an even more sophisticated way of manipulating. Curves are extraordinarily hard to explain until you try to do it, right? And then it starts to make sense. but it's something that generally requires Photoshop. And it's very fine adjustments of what parts of an image are light and what parts of an image are black. So I'm not going to try to explain it verbally. I'm just going to show you when we get to that portion of the class. So then we get to our final results, right? Exporting our images, printing our images, etc. This is, for the most part now, we're posting online. It's very rare that people print out photos and make photo albums anymore, right? Generally, you throw them up on Facebook or Instagram, and that constitutes it. You could take it even a step farther, like my wife does. She posts all her pictures on Instagram and then has these books made from her Instagram pictures, and they come to her door, you know? And so it's interesting how things have changed, right? From the old days where you went to the store and they developed the pictures and you put them in an album. So things have changed quite a bit. So for the most part, you're going to be doing some kind of an online export. But if you were trying to do high quality prints or something like that, you would be exporting in high quality and then printing either on a really fancy printer or sending it off to a print shop even better. Variety of web galleries. You guys are all familiar with these. When I first started lecturing about it, it was like a new thing to post your pictures online. Now it's like so common that it's like, why do I even talk about it? Okay? So we're going to take a quick break. That was a little bit shorter than average, and then we'll come back maybe in 10 minutes, and I'll go through exercise 104 in detail and kind of walk you through how these steps happen in the world of Photoshop. Okay, so we'll come back in like 10 minutes, so 8:53, 8:54, something like that. Okay, so we're going to start up again, and I'm going to walk through some of these steps in Photoshop and try to explain in a little bit better detail what's really going on and how we're going to make our images better. But I wanted to point out one thing and remember, and I'm just trying to reinforce certain things that we've already talked about. If I want my Dropbox stuff to be backed up correctly, I have to make sure that I launch the Dropbox portable application. So I just plugged in my hard drive to work on today. First thing I'm going to do is launch that Dropbox portable, make sure it's running, and it'll show up down here after a little bit of time. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to open up Photoshop, and then we'll talk through kind of the basics of Photoshop. So generally it's available in this first menu in one of the shortcuts. If it's not, you can go to All Programs, and then it's under the Adobe Design Standard CS6, and you're going to be picking Adobe Photoshop CS6. I think it's been fixed on these computers, but if you just double-click a Photoshop file, it used to open in CS3, not CS6. So you want to make sure that you do, in fact, open CS6, which is, on our computers, the most current version that we have. The Adobe Creative Cloud, if you have your own computer, is a newer version. Generally, in Photoshop, they're backwards compatible, so it's not too big of a deal. Okay, so I have Photoshop opened here. And I want to walk through kind of what's going on the screen in Photoshop. Some of you are familiar with Photoshop. If I had to predict the pieces of software that you are more familiar with, more of you would be familiar with Photoshop than any of the other Adobe products. But I still want to go through kind of the basics and explain what's going on here. So up at the top here, just like in any of the programs you're used to, there is a file structure with menus. So we have File, Edit, Image, etc. Some of the commands will be only available from up here in the menu structure. Certainly some of the stuff that we're dealing with today with adjustment layers and that sort of thing will be available up here. I'll obviously walk you through that. Directly below these menus is a ribbon that changes based on whatever your active command is. So if, for example, I switch to the crop command, the ribbon would change and give me options related to cropping. If I were to change to the clone stamp tool, right, it would give me options related to clone stamping. So that ribbon is always changing. So once you have a command active, you want to be able to look at that and see what's available in terms of options. On the left side here, we have our standard tool set, move, marquee tools, selection tools, cropping. The eyedropper is a way of selecting a particular color. Then we come down into brushes, clone stamping, erasers, etc. Right? We'll be dealing with dodging and burning, which is down here a little bit more today. And as we come further down, we have a foreground and a background color, which isn't too relevant for what we're doing today, but will become more relevant as we go forward. On the right side over here, we have a variety of menus that will show up. The one that I'm most concerned with right now is something called layers. Generally, it's on by default and will be on the lower side of whatever your menus are available. And we're going to look at the layers in more depth as we start to create layers. Okay? So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to open an image. And so I'll go to File and then Open. And from here, I can browse for any image file. It could be a RAW file. It could be a JPEG image file. In my case, I'm going to look on my flash drive, into my Dropbox folder, and into Exercise 104, which contains a bunch of photos that I'm going to work with today as samples. Okay? You'll need to download the photos from your camera onto your computer to be able to work with this. I'm asking you to pick, pick 3 images, whatever your favorites are, of the ones that you shot last class. Okay? So just pick 3, and we're going to do the same steps to all 3 images. And through doing the 3 images, you'll learn that some adjustments apply to some images and some don't apply to other images. So I'm going to go ahead and start with this image here, though I have a few other images that I'll work with. Okay? So let me go ahead and open up 3, and then we'll work through all 3 at the same time. Let me open this one, and let me open this one. And I tried to pick several different images shot in different ways so that we get kind of a cross of what's going on. All right, so we'll start with this first image here. And what we're going to do is we're going to convert this image to black. Actually, before I convert to black and white, let me at least talk through the crop tool. These images have kind of already been cropped. Maybe I could crop this one a little bit better. So in the crop tool, it's 2 black kind of intersecting rectangles with a line through it. It's available. It's the 4th one down, 5th one down on your toolbar. And when I click the crop tool, I look at my options here in my rule here. I have unconstrained, or I can choose to have it cropped to the original ratio, or pick any other ratio, right? So for example, 1:1 would be a square. 16:9 would be a movie format, right? So I'm not overly concerned. Maybe I'll go with the original ratio. Notice that I have view set to rule of thirds, right? This is the default. I could change. We talked about some of the other compositional techniques here. I'm going to leave it at rule of thirds so I get my thirds. And I want this to be readjusted. So I'm adjusting my crop here, right, such that this pastry is falling more on that rule of thirds line. Right? We use that blur line in the background there. We'll have that fall there. And the idea being that this is a better shot of this particular dessert. I'm not trying to make you hungry. Okay? So there it is, and I've cropped it. Once I was done, I checked that little box that said OK, and now my crop is done. And I can continue on. Okay? If I wanted to crop, say, this image, right, I could do the same thing. I'd go to my crop tool right here. I could choose to make it the original ratio, or again, unconstrained, or any other ratio I wanted. And then we'll go ahead and start adjusting. Right? And again, I'm just dragging the corners here. I kind of like that corner. Maybe that should be a little bit more like that. Maybe that house should be 1/3 of the way over. You know, that's a little too high. We'll go with something like that. Right? So this is roughly on 1/3 there. Seems reasonable. Okay? So I'll go ahead and say OK there. A little checkbox. So I've done the basic cropping. Now we're going to go through and convert the images to black and white. And there's 2 different ways of doing this in Photoshop. One is a good way of doing it, and another is not so good. The first way would be to go to Image, and then Mode, and say Grayscale. Right? The problem is that this strips out a bunch of the information. And we don't really want to do that. And furthermore, we want this to be a reversible change that we've made. So instead, I'm going to go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer. And I'm going to do a channel mixer. Right? By the way, this is written up in Photoshop 1.1 on the website. So if I were to, I'm going to have to log in. Sorry about that. Bear with me for just a second. Well, that's interesting. I have no keyboard. All right, well, never mind. We're not going to log in. Yeah, that's bizarre. So Photoshop 1.1 black and white. And if I were logged in, there would be a video right here at the top that walks you through these exact steps. So if you get a little bit lost, there's no problem. There's the information for you. But it's going to walk through what we're going to do. Right? So again, we're not doing image mode grayscale. Instead, we're going to go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, Channel Mixer. So I'm going to call this, instead of Channel Mixer 1, I'm going to call it black and white. Oh, I can't type. Okay, you know what? Let's pause for just a second, and let me see if I can get the keyboard. Okay, so we managed to fix that. Sorry about that. No idea what was going on. Okay, so I'm going to call this black and white. And I'll go ahead and say OK. And once I've done the black and white, you'll see that I get this little window that says Properties, the Channel Mixer Properties that's available. I also see over here in my layers that I used to have background, and now I have a layer on top of background that says black and white, which is the idea. So here, under the Properties menu, I'm going to check this box for monochrome, which basically means convert to black and white. Okay? And we'll see that the image goes from color to black and white. I do, however, under Preset, have a bunch of presets. Right? Black and white infrared, black and white with a blue filter, green filter, orange filter, red filter, and yellow filter. Right? These are designed to mimic if I was actually shooting with a film camera and I attached a filter onto my lens to filter certain light. It doesn't really matter what they're filtering for. The point is you can go through each of these and you'll see that the black and white image will change depending on which filter I have applied. Right? And so because this isn't a technical photography class, we don't need to talk about why the orange looks better than the blue. I just want you to go through each of these until you find one that looks good to you, to your eye. Okay? So in this case, I'm going to use the red filter on this particular image. Now the advantage here is that I can turn on and turn off the layer using this little eye next to the layer and have the image in black and white and have the image in color. So I have complete flexibility with this. You have a question? Okay, we can talk after. Go grab a seat in the back. All right, so let's look here at this image. This one obviously has a little bit more color in it to begin with, so it may be a little bit more dramatic to switch it to black and white. So I'm going to do the same process on this image. I'm going to go up to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, Channel Mixer. There. We'll call this black and white again. And I'll go ahead and say OK. And then I'm going to check the box for monochrome, which I just did. And you can see that immediately it turns to black and white. But now I'm going to go into my presets, and I'm going to say, what does it look like with an infrared filter? Okay, well, that doesn't look very good. What's it look like with a blue filter? It's still a little bit dark. How about a green filter? Okay, maybe a little bit better. Right? How about an orange filter? Much lighter. How about a red filter? Very light. Okay. And how about a yellow filter? Well, the yellow filter might look the best of the bunch. Okay. So the point is you go through these presets. I can also adjust the red, the green, and the blue values here, though I don't recommend doing that until you're very, very comfortable with what you're trying to do. The one thing I will point out is that the total here is always equal to 100%. So if I were to skew this with more red, right, these wouldn't match up to 100%. I would need to compensate for it with less of something else. Okay? So again, I'm going to go back to the yellow filter because I think that looks pretty good. And once again, I have the ability to turn on or turn off, right, the black and white. Okay? So I can do that again with this image. And again, I'm repeating for these three images because you're going to be doing three images the same as I am. So I'll go up to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, Channel Mixer. We'll call it black and white again. There it is. Check the box for monochrome. Okay? And then I'll go through again with all of my various settings until I find the one that I think looks the best. So in my case, on this one, I think the red filter is actually the best because I like the sky to be a little bit darker with the lighter showing up here. Okay, so I'll go ahead and leave that. So again, I have the ability to turn that black and white on or turn it off, okay, which is exactly what you'll be doing. So that's the first piece that we're doing, which is Photoshop 1.1. We're going to go back to the first image, and we're going to go through the next, which is Photoshop 1.2, or levels, right? Which is, again, available on the course website here. Now that I can type, I can actually log in and show you the full page here. There we go. And so I'm going to go to Tutorials, Photoshop 1.2 for levels. Right here. And again, I have the little videos available so that you can watch those after the fact if you get a little bit lost or whatever. And so what we're going to do here, and I know this says CS3, it doesn't need to be CS3, is we're going to go again to a new adjustment layer, and this time we're going to pick levels instead of channel mixer. So I'll come back over here. I'm going to go to, and probably the most dramatic difference will be in this particular image. Let me go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, Levels. It's the second one down. And I'll leave this named Levels because it is, in fact, going to be a levels adjustment. And I'll go ahead and say OK. And you'll see that my Properties window, which used to be the channel mixer and used to be showing me information about black and white, is now showing me information about levels, or the histogram. And so, as I said before, if I were to look at this image, and let me zoom it in a little bit, right? So you see how it becomes individual little pixels, right? As I zoom in, doesn't matter how I zoomed in. We'll cover zoom a little bit later. If I were to count the number of pixels that are white, right, and then very, very light gray, gray, etc., and make a tally of them and graph them, they would show up on this histogram, right? So pixels at this end are dark gray, pixels at this end are approaching white, and then at the very end would be white itself, right? As I look at this. And this is just the count, or the number of pixels that are that particular color in the image. So depending on what image we're looking at, the histogram, or the graph of that image, is going to be different. And that's normal. Okay, so let me go back to where I have the whole image here. And I'm going to look at this. Now, if I look at this graph, I don't really have a pure black in this image yet. Okay, I just have kind of a dark gray. On the white end of the spectrum, it looks like I do have a few pixels that are purely white, and they're probably right here in the sun in this particular image. So as I do a levels adjustment, I'm going to grab this triangle right here, and I'm going to drag it over. And as I do that, I'm choosing where black is. So I'm going to pull it over, and the general rule of thumb is to go to whatever the point is where the graph starts to spike. Right? So I'll pull it all the way over to right about there. Okay? Likewise, on the white end, right, I don't really have to pull this back. Maybe I'd pull it back a little tiny bit to where the graph starts to spike up in that direction. And by doing that, I've taken the image that was this, kind of muted, and I've given it some deeper shadows. Now, it's hard on the screen for you guys to really see this as dramatic as it will be on your screens when you do it. Okay? So let's go ahead and do a levels adjustment again on the next image. Then, like I said, I picked these three different images because they're very different, and we'll see differences as we go through. So let me go ahead, and again, I'll go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, Levels. I'll say OK, and there it is. So notice the histogram for this image is very, very different than the image we just saw. Okay? In this image, white, pure white, right, is much further back. Okay? But black is pretty close because there's some nice deep black right here. Okay? So if I were adjusting this image, maybe I'd pull the black just a bit over. Okay, maybe like that. But the white is what needs to be adjusted, and that's going to come over to about there. Right? Notice that I could pull it much further and get it much lighter. Right? Obviously, I'm losing detail, though. So we'll set that there. There is also a triangle that's in the middle, and that sets the medium gray value. And so by default, it's set right in the middle, but I can adjust it and make the overall image a little bit lighter or a little bit darker. Right? So it's set by default at 1, but I could push it just a little bit if I wanted that medium gray a little bit shifted. Okay? So there it is. We'll move over again to this last image. We turn off the black and white, and we'll again go back and go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, Levels. And I'll say OK. And so in this image, as we look at it, we have pure white, plenty of pixels at pure white. We have mostly pure black already, right, in the trees and up in here. So there's really not a whole lot that I can do in a levels adjustment. So the reason that I'm pointing it out across these 3 images is sometimes a levels adjustment just isn't necessary. Right? In this case, it really isn't necessary. Maybe I could pull the black over a little bit, but the chances of you being able to see the difference between that subtle adjustment is almost non-existent. Okay? So, yes, I'm asking you to do this for each of your images, but you may find that your image just doesn't need it. Right? And that's okay. You do it anyway, and you learn from it. Okay? So I've now done Photoshop 1.2 for each of these images. Okay? We're going to move on to Photoshop 1.3, which is curves. So I'm going to, again, work with this first image, right? And I'm going to choose to leave the levels on rather than off at this point. Notice also that I can stack the black and white and the levels together. So I can have them both on, or I can have them off independently of each other, okay? Which is, again, the advantage of the levels. I'm going to work, or continue to work in color, because I think you could see a little bit better information. So, once again, as my voice is failing me, we're going to go to Photoshop 1.3, or curves. And I have a walkthrough of what's actually happening here. But the reason that I pull this up is I'm going to refer back to these images in a little bit more detail. Okay? So when I go, it's the same process. I go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer. This time it's going to be Curves. And we can leave it called Curves. Okay? I get a different graph. And this one contains a little bit more information. So behind this, I get the histogram again. Right? So it's the same little graph. But I also get a diagonal line that goes from black at this point to white at this point. Okay? Kind of on this diagonal. Now, what I can choose to do with this is I can drag this line such that I can control whether light points are lighter or darker, and dark points are darker or lighter. Okay? The easiest thing to do is to actually do it and see what happens. Okay? So let's say I were to grab this in the center of the curve. So I'm going to click and hold, and I'm going to drag the whole curve up. Okay? And as I do that, you can see that the whole image gets lighter. Okay? Likewise, if I were to drag the curve down, the whole image gets darker. Right? So if I went from right there, which is where I was, down, the sky looks pretty good there. Right? But the ground is really, really dark. Vice versa, the ground looks pretty good right there, but the sky is too light. Okay? So what I can do instead of grabbing it at the center is I can click at the center to create that little black point, which anchors the center. Okay? Then I can come up here to the lighter part of the image, and I can choose to make the sky darker or lighter independent, right, of the other side of the image. Likewise, I can choose to make the ground lighter or darker. So see, when I'm moving this, it's really not changing the sky at all. It's just changing the ground. So I can very easily change certain select points in the image. So I might lighten that up just a little bit, right? And I might continue to fuss with these a little bit, and maybe about like that. It's a pretty good compromise of sky and ground. Okay? It generally doesn't involve too large of a swing. Okay? Let me go back really fast, and I'm going to do this again to show you what a large swing might do. So let me go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, Curves. Now notice, because these are all adjustment layers, it's really easy for me to try again, to stack it on, and then I can turn it on, turn it off, etc. Okay? So what can happen, though, when I'm doing these adjustments, let me set this at one point, is I can end up kind of blowing out parts of the image. I can do too far in one direction or the other. Right? Something like that is probably not what I'm going for. Okay? So you have to be kind of careful with how far you're pushing the envelope of what you're doing. I mean, yes, this might work nicely for some kind of an alien landscape or something, but it's probably not exactly what I was after. Right? So generally, it's going to be a very subtle, what's called an S-curve, right? Something like that. It's going to give us kind of a nice end result. And you'll have to determine whether going this direction is good or going the opposite direction, maybe something like that, is a little bit better. To me, this is a little bit too muted, so I'd probably end up more in this direction. Right? But you can play around with that. Now notice, of course, I can also change the center of the image so the whole image is a little bit darker. So I've got a lot of flexibility in what happens. But the easiest way to learn about curves is to do it, and to do it on each of your images. So we'll go ahead and leave that on, and we'll move to the next image. I'm really sorry about my voice. Anyway, so we're going to go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, Curves. And so once again, we're presented with the same curves. So I can take the whole image, and I can make the whole image a little bit lighter or a little bit darker. Or I can leave that in the center, and I can work with just the lighter parts of the image and the darker parts of the image. Going like that. In this case, it's really kind of saturating the colors out a little bit better. Right? So if we were doing the cookbook, right? You guys have seen cookbooks before that have the great pictures of food in them, right? Chances are it's not the original picture that somebody shot. They probably did some of this post-processing. Maybe the pastry dough isn't quite that yellow in reality, right? But the picture looks better because of it. So let's move to this last one here. Same thing. We're going to go to Image, or excuse me, Layer, New Adjustment Layer, Curves. We'll go ahead and say OK. We'll peg the center, and then we'll adjust that up a little bit and that down a little bit. And we get the change. Right? So there to there. Right? Subtle change. You'll be able to see it a little bit better on your screens when you're doing your actual images. Okay? So let's move on into the next one, which is 1.4, making images pop. And this one, we're going to actually use the channel mixer again. And so we're going to layer it up, but we're not going to do it to make the image black and white. Instead, we're going to go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, Channel Mixer, and we're going to push the values of individual channels of color. Okay? And I'm starting with this image because we'll probably see more dramatic results. Okay? So I'm not checking monochrome, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to boost the value of red in the red output channel. So let me go here, and I'm going to say this is maybe 116, and I'm going to do green at -8 and blue at -8. Remember I said that the percentage we always want to have be 100%. Okay? Then I'm going to go from the red channel to the green channel using this little drop-down menu, and I'm going to boost the green to 116 with these at -8 and -8. And then I'll go to the blue channel. Same thing, boost the blue to 116, and then -8, -8. Now, the 116, 118, 120, something like that, is an arbitrary value that seems to work pretty well. Okay? Could I do it much higher? Could I go 130? Sure. Right? I could do 130 and then -15 and -15. Right? And what that's doing is it's boosting the blue a lot in this particular image. And it may or may not be desirable depending on what your final outputs are. If I continue to push this up, right, you can see that the image gets more and more blue. Right? So I could go all the way to 200%. I could go -50 and -50. Right? And I'd get an awful lot of blue saturation happening. Okay? And this one's a little bit hard for you guys to see on screen. But when you do it on yours, you can see that boost in overall saturation. So in reality, 116 -8 -8 seems pretty good. Okay? The key is that I want to do it for each of the channels. So blue channel, 116 -8 -8. Green, 116 -8 -8. Red, 116 -8 -8. And so what that does is it subtly boosts all the colors in the photo just a bit. Right? And so it's not a huge amount, but it's enough to just give you a little bit more. This works particularly well in sunset photos. Right? You just boost those colors a bit. Okay? So you'll see it when you do it in your own work, that it just makes a little bit of a difference. So I'm going to continue and do it for these others. So once again, I'll go to the Layer, New Adjustment Layer, channel mixer. And we can call this pop. Say OK. And I'll go through. In the red channel, we're going to go 116 minus 8 minus 8. Green, 116 minus 8 minus 8. And blue, 116 minus 8 minus 8. Okay? So what was before this image now has just a little bit more color in it. And so in this particular example, as I'm looking at it on my screen, it may be a little bit too yellow. It might have too much. So I'd probably dial it back. But you have to decide what's the right value. Same thing on this image. Again, layer, new adjustment layer, channel mixer. And we'll call this pop. Say OK. And then this is going to be 116 minus 8 minus 8 minus 8 minus 8 minus 8 minus 8. So it just boosts those colors a little bit. Okay? So I've done that for all of my images. And now I'm going to move on to the last one, which is dodging and burning. Okay? And this one is entirely different with how we go about it. And as you get a little bit further and more comfortable in Photoshop, you'll see what we're really doing. But for right now, you just have to follow the steps. So thus far, everything I've done, I've went to the layer menu and said new adjustment layer. Okay? This time, we're going to go to the layer menu, and I'm just going to say new layer. So layer, new layer. Okay? Which brings up the new layer. I'm going to name the layer Dodge and Burn. And so this technique mimics what you used to do in a dark room with chemicals. Right? You'd selectively lighten or darken a particular negative with chemicals. Okay? We don't do that anymore, but we do it digitally. Okay? So this is Dodge and Burn. I'm going to change right here under Mode. I'm going to change that to Overlay. And I'm going to check this box that appears after I choose the mode of overlay as fill with an overlay neutral color of 50% gray. Okay? So I check the box for overlay neutral, and I go ahead and say OK. And so when it's done, you see that I create a layer, and that layer over here looks entirely different. It's kind of a gray square. Okay? I'm going to work on this layer using the Dodge and Burn tools, which are available. The dodging tool looks like a little ball with a point on the end, right? And the burn tool looks like a little hand. Okay? The burn tool darkens, the dodge tool lightens. So let's start with the burn tool. And when I have the burn tool selected, you'll see that my cursor changes to a circle, right? Which is essentially a brush that I'm then going to use. Now I want the brush to be a little bit bigger. So I can come up here and I can change the size slider, right? Again, this is in my ribbon that has to do with the dodging and burning. I can change the size slider to be up and go up a little higher, and you can see that that circle gets bigger and bigger, right? At some point, it gets really large. Okay. So we want kind of a happy medium, something like that, right? Then below that, I have something called hardness. And so the hardness of the brush is currently set at 0%, which means it's a very diffuse brush. If I change this to be at 100%, it would be a perfect circle, as if the brush was completely solid, no edges, right? So you can imagine in non-technical terms that a very diffuse brush or a soft brush would be like a watercolor brush, where the center is kind of the color, and then the water kind of slowly goes away from that circle. The opposite would be I have a stamp, and I paint red on it, and I put it on the piece of paper, and it makes like a red circle, right, with nothing outside of it. So you're going to adjust that. For the purposes of what we're doing, we want a very soft brush, so we'll set it at 0%. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to choose where on the image I want it to be a little bit darker. So maybe I'll fill in here, and you can see that that part of the sky gets a little bit darker. Maybe I'll fill in over here, and I'll make that part a little bit darker. Right, something like that. The more I do it, the darker it becomes. Okay? The nice thing about doing it this way is I can switch and I can say, let me go back to the dodge tool. Again, same options. And I can say, no, actually, I wanted it a little bit lighter, and I can go back and lighten up a particular part of that. Okay? Likewise, I could choose to lighten up part of this part of the image. Maybe something like that, right? Depending on what feels appropriate. Okay? So mostly you're going to be darkening kind of the corners, right? That sort of thing. Let's move on and do it on this layer, or on this one. I'm going to turn off the pop because it's just too yellow. And I'm going to come and go back to Layer, New Layer, Mode Overlay, Fill with Neutral Gray, and we'll call this Dodge and Burn. I'll go ahead and say OK. And then I'm going to come back to the Dodge and Burn tool. So we'll start with Burn. Maybe I want to darken up that piece of pastry there a little bit. Maybe I'll darken underneath here. Something like that. Maybe I want to lighten the background. Let me go to the Dodge tool, and we'll just kind of lighten that up a little bit so that those aren't competing quite as much with the image itself. So, as with before, right, this is something that I can choose to change. Right? I can choose to turn it on or turn it off. Okay? But I'm making these adjustments to the image. We go to the last one. Once again, Layer, New Layer, Dodge and Burn, Mode, Overlay, Fill with the Neutral 50% Gray. Go ahead and say OK. And we'll start with the Burn. And I'm going to darken up the sky a little bit. Right? Now, it is possible to push this a little bit too far. Right? I could make this too blue, which I probably have, but you get the idea. And then maybe I want to go back and I want to dodge this area and make it a little bit lighter. Or maybe I want to dodge that a little bit. Yeah, depending. Okay? To me, this is probably too, I probably need to do the opposite. I probably need to burn it. Let's burn that back here. Darken that up. Yeah, something like that. Okay? So you'll have to play around with what feels right for your particular images. Okay? So I've now gone through all of the steps, and I've gotten to the point where it's time to save my work. Okay? So when we're working in Photoshop, generally there's always going to be two outputs. We're going to save the Photoshop file, which is a .psd, okay? And that file will allow us to go back in and perform more edits and keep our layers. Okay? Then we will also use Save for Web to save a JPEG version of our final image. Okay? So I'll start with this first image here. And I'm going to go to File, Save first. And it's going to say Photoshop.psd. Okay, so we'll save it here. I'm going to create a folder for this semester. So this is spring of 2016. And so this is going to save as the name .psd. I'll go ahead and click Save. This maximize compatibility means that if you have Creative Cloud and you have this box checked, you'll be able to open it in the older versions of Photoshop. Okay? So we'll go ahead and say OK. And it will save that particular file. Then we'll move on to this one. And I'll go to File and Save. Same thing. I want it to be .psd. We're going to save it right here. And it will save. And we'll move to my last file. And I'll go to File and then Save. And again, it should be .psd. And we'll save it right here. OK, so now that I have each of those saved as Photoshop files, we need to start creating the output for what we're posting on the website today. Okay? Now, there's going to be a total of 18 images that you're going to post today. A lot of images. Right? Thus far, we've always done just one image. Okay? So a lot of images to post. So we're going to go through and save those images right now. Okay? So I'm going to go to this first piece here, and I'm going to turn everything off, all of my layers off, so that I have just the background on. And I'm going to go to File, Save for Web. And of course, it's going to be slow, right? And we'll wait for it to come up. Okay, I want to change under preset here. I want to get over into the JPEG realm. So I had, last time I saved something, it was a PNG. I want it to be a JPEG. I want the resolution to be JPEG high, right? And generally speaking, you're going to want to leave this image size the same as whatever it is. Now, since we're posting 18 images today, we can cut the file sizes down. It's going to slow down the website enormously if everybody tries to post their full-size images. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set my width, right, to, I don't know, maybe 600. And my height automatically adjusts to 896 pixels in this context. Okay? So I'm going to leave that image size. Again, I'm deliberately stripping this down. And then I'll go ahead and click on the Save button. And when I do that, I want it to go onto my flash drive, into my Dropbox folder. Here's today's folder, 2016. I'm going to create a new folder, and we'll call this Output, just for organizational purposes. And I'm going to append to this file name Original. And then I'll go ahead and click Save. So this was the original image. Okay? Now that that's done, I'll come in and I'll turn on just the black and white. And I'll go to File, Save for Web. And the good news is my settings are still here in JPEG, but I'm going to change my width again to 600. I'll click Save. And this is now black and white. So I'll do _BW, and then go ahead and click Save. Then I'll turn off black and white, and I'll turn on levels. And I'll go to File, Save for Web. Does this make sense so far? Okay, so you go through for each one of these. And I'll click Save. And this is levels. I'm not going to do it for everyone. And I'll go ahead and click Save. Okay? Once I have all of those 18 images, I'm going to go ahead and create the post for today. Okay, so I'll go back to the website. I'm going to go to New, Post. And we're going to load these images slightly differently than we have done in the past because there's so many of them. We're going to create a little slideshow instead. Okay? So there are instructions on the back of your handout today that walk you through how to do this part of it. Obviously, you guys aren't at the point where you have the images ready, so I'm going to show you how to do it, but then you'll have to do it on your own in a little bit. Okay? So I'm going to go ahead and say this is exercise 104. It's me. And I'm going to come down here and make sure I check the box for exercise 104. There we go. There it is. Okay. Now, what I'm going to do is right here under this, below where the publish link is, there's something called Format. And I'm going to change the format of my post to be a gallery instead. Okay. As soon as I choose gallery, I can choose to turn on a slideshow on my page. There's a little green slider there. Okay. Then I'm going to go to this gallery tab, okay, which is right here. I have Content, General, and then Gallery. I'll click on that, and you'll see a blue button for Insert Gallery or Add Images. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and click on that. And right here, I can select my files. And the good news is I can actually select them all at once. So if I do this, however, I have to be rather slow in the process. Right? But here we go. I'll hold down Control, and I'll select each one. I'll go ahead and say Open. And it's going to try to go through and load each one. Now, if you do all 18, this could take 5 to 10 minutes for it to upload. But if you cut the file size down, it shouldn't be too long. Okay? Once I'm done, we have those images. Right? I'm going to click on Save All Changes. Good. And from here, I can go ahead and close. There's some options for the gallery, but I'll go ahead and close it. And I'm going to go ahead and publish. Okay? So this, I'm not done yet, but I'm going to go ahead and publish as a way of, yes, I'm committing to these images. So we'll be patient for a second. Okay, so now it's been published. Okay, but I still have a few more things to do. One, I want to set the featured image. So I'll come all the way down and click on Set Featured Image. Now I've already uploaded the files. Right? So I can go here under Media Library, and I can say, show me just the ones uploaded to this particular post. And when I do that, it's going to show me the files, in your case 18, in my case it was only 3, that were uploaded to this particular post, and I can pick the one that I want as my featured image. There it is, and I can set the featured image, which will show up here. And there it is as a featured image. Now I can come up here, I can go to the Gallery tab again, and I can see that, yes, my images were added, and they're correctly put in. Okay, you'll have a lot more images. After that, I'll go ahead and click Update. And once the update's done, I'm going to view the post and make sure they show up correctly altogether. But again, that's written out step by step on the back, so you'll be able to do that and follow along. If you run into trouble, of course, let me know. So I'm going to go ahead and click on View Post and make sure that it did, in fact, post correctly. There it is. Right? Now notice that this is now a live slideshow of images that I can go through and see all of my images. So rather than have a bunch of images, right, it's just consolidated into a nice little slideshow. Okay? Any questions? All right.